Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Ryan, and I'm the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special Askwith forum tonight, which features Claude Steele, the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at UC Berkeley. It's great to see so many of you from all across Harvard and beyond. I'd like to extend a special hello to those of you watching in the overflow space on campus and watching the live stream online, including high school students and teachers at Newton North, HGSE alumni at DePaul University in Chicago, and HGSE alumni from the International Education Policy Program who, at Professor Fernando Reamer's great suggestion, are gathered in cities across the world to watch tonight's event. Don't forget to join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag Askwith. I have no idea how you do this, but I assume some of you will know how to do this. Let me tell you a little bit about the format of tonight's event. I'll offer some brief introductory remarks, and then we will hear from Dr. Steele. Following his presentation, our own Pamela Mason will pose some questions, and then we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience. Pamela is a lecturer at HGSE and the faculty director of the Language and Literacy Program. She's also the chair of the Dean's Advisory Committee for Equity and Diversity. I'm delighted that she'll act as discussant this evening. Tonight's forum is part of a year-long community conversation on the topic of fulfilling the promise of diversity. To help set the stage for this conversation, HGSE students and faculty were asked over the summer to read Dr. Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi. Everyone in the community has since been invited to participate in a conversation, or many conversations really, about the ways that we can best realize the many benefits of diverse schools, including our own. I recognize that these conversations can at times be difficult or uncomfortable, but despite this, or actually because of this, we've chosen to have this conversation across the community, across the academic year at HGSE for at least three reasons. First, because as educators, I believe we have a responsibility to work toward a society in which our differences and the many characteristics that comprise our identity cease to be seen as problems to be overcome and instead are rightly recognized as our greatest source of strength. Second, because there are not enough people who have the skills and courage to facilitate the sometimes difficult interactions that will be needed to make this hope a reality. And third, because the best place to learn these skills is within a community like ours, a community of trust. With this in mind, I'm honored and delighted to welcome one of the most trusted voices in the conversation on race, stereotype, and identity, Dr. Claude Steele. Dr. Steele is one of the great social psychologists of our time, whose work has had a powerful influence not only in the field, but in the larger discussion surrounding race and identity in America. He's well known for his groundbreaking work in advancing the theory of stereotype threat, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes. And he's also contributed tremendously to our understanding of education, including the achievement gap, testing, and college completion. His work in sum deals insightfully and creatively with some of the most complex and important challenges facing society. But what makes him truly extraordinary is his ability to take complicated ideas and findings and write, speak, and teach about them in ways that are compelling, convincing, and galvanizing. To cite just one example, Dr. Steele once compared the SAT and other standardized tests used to predict school performance to selecting a player for a basketball team based on the number of free throws he could hit. As he pointed out, if you did this, you'd never pick Shaquille O'Neal for your team because he's terrible at free throws, but he's obviously a magnificent basketball player. And that's what a standardized test does compared to the domain of real school performance. For his important contributions, Dr. Steele has rightfully earned numerous awards and honors, which would take up the entire time allotted for this event if I went through all of them, so I will summarize. He's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He has received a plethora of awards in recognition of his outstanding teaching and his scholarly work, and he's received honorary degrees from multiple colleges and universities, including the University of Michigan, the University of Chicago, Princeton, and Yale. He's also been a widely respected leader in higher education. He served for nearly 20 years as a faculty member at Stanford, during which time he was the director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and also served as the director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. He has served as provost of Columbia University, as dean of, I can't remember, it's an education school somewhere out west. Oh, dean of the Stanford Education School, before becoming, just this past March, the executive vice chancellor and provost at UC Berkeley. During this time, he managed to publish a truly magnificent book, Whistling Vivaldi, which I know many of you have read. The book is about just what its subtitle says, How Stereotype Affects Us and What We Can Do. And it's this twin purpose of the book that I think makes it such a remarkable achievement. It not only analyzes the problem, but offers suggestions to address it. And let me cite just one telling example. Towards the end of the book, Dr. Steele talks about a series of experiments he and a colleague devised that featured white male subjects who were told that they were going to have a conversation with two African American males. And the conversation would either be about racial profiling or about love and relationships. The person running the experiment would tell the white subject this and then leave to bring in the other participants and say casually, "Oh, could you please rearrange the chairs for the conversation?" And when told that the conversation was going to be about racial profiling, the white male subject would put his chair farther apart from the two chairs for the other participants. Then when told that the conversation was going to be about love and relationships. Probing more deeply, Dr. Steele discovered that the distancing resulted not from racial prejudice, but from the fear on the part of the white male subject that he would confirm the whites are racist stereotype. That is, the white subjects were literally distancing themselves from their conversation partners when the conversation was going to be about racial profiling because they were worried that they would appear racist when discussing the racially charged issue of racial profiling. Now, you could just stop there and say that's an interesting and important finding about how stereotypes affect us, and a somewhat depressing finding. But Dr. Steele and his colleague went further, and in the next round of experiments, told some white male subjects who were going to discuss racial profiling that this is a conversation that naturally involves some tension, and it's a difficult conversation to have, and this is key, and this conversation will be a learning experience for all. Lo and behold, those who were told, who were given this instruction, the same white male subjects who were given this instruction, put their chairs closer. Now, I know the chairs in this auditorium are bolted to the floor, but I hope tonight's talk and our year-long conversation on the topic of diversity will lead all of us to move our chairs a little bit closer. Please join me in welcoming Claude Steele.
Well, thank you. That was a great introduction. It took a third of my lecture, but it was a great introduction. You did such a great job of it. First, I just want to say what a real pleasure it is to be here. I feel some kind of kinship to Harvard. I think it has to do with the fact that I've been here a lot, and I have a great number of really, really good friends here. So I always love to get a chance to come back and talk to you. And also, I'm coming to the Ed School. I feel I belong. You know, this is home. So it's a real excitement for me to come today, and I'm looking forward to a real robust conversation. My strategy will just be to give a talk that will kind of warm us all up, and then I think we're going to have time for some questions, both planned questions and some questions from the audience. So it should be a good, vigorous evening. I am going to talk about stereotype threat and social identity threat. And I am going to make the case that these are big deals, that they're important things, they're important phenomena, important social, psychological phenomenon that have a big influence on our lives, probably in a daily basis and sometimes in a real ongoing way, that they can affect the people that we feel comfortable with, the kind of friendships we form, that they can affect the regions of the country we want to live in. They can affect our career choices, what walks of life we feel comfortable in. They can affect our immediate performances, intellectual performances, academic performances, athletic performances, a variety of things. So I'm going to be making the case that they're subtle and kind of nuanced and maybe a little Delphic, but that they're powerful. But I don't want to be depressing. So I'm going to somehow try to pull that off. And I suppose the best way to do it is to get through the basic picture of the situation and then get into a discussion of remedies and the sources of these threats, where they come from, and where they have the unwanted effects that they have, and what we can do about it, both as institutions and as individuals. So that will be my strategy. I'll start out with an analysis, but I will be on my way to some kind of discussion of remedies. Other things as subtext I like to stress at the outset. One is that you won't hear a single idea today that we had at the outset of this research program. Every idea came from doing the work and having our one idea after the other sort of bashed against the rocks of data. And then having to sit around for sometimes like, a year to figure out what to do next. So I really do want to give you that sense that there's something trying but something exhilarating about the scientific process of tracking down a line of reasoning and extracting it from the evidence you have. So I hope you get that sense of it. That is the spirit in which I wrote the book, as a kind of mystery story. It all begins with a certain problem, and I'll begin the talk with a description of that problem. The other thing that I would like to, as a subtext, is the importance of context on who we are, the context. I think this research gives a very vivid example, a concrete take-home example of how context can affect things that we think of in very decontextualized way, like intellectual ability, like even athletic ability, like relationships. It's hard for us as humans to appreciate the impact of the context on these things. But I hope that you'll see in this research something that we take for granted as measurable outside of any context, and that measure is very generalizable across all kinds of circumstances and situations, that context can have a huge effect on these features of human beings. So that's another subtext. I'll start, as I say, with the problem that really started this research. It's just a plain old, how do you understand this problem kind of story. And then I'll get to stereotype threat, kind of remind people of that and illustrate that concept for us again. And then I'll get to the issue of remedies and what to do, and how, again, surprising the strategies were to us. Okay. The problem, as I describe in the book, I tend to think of these things biographically now. And this happened when I moved to the University of Michigan in the late 80s, and I was put on a committee for the retention and recruitment of minority students. And as I sat down, one of the handouts right on the top of the stack of papers that were handed out was a graph that really captured this problem in a very vivid way. It was the grades that Michigan students got at Michigan, their cumulative grade averages, as a function of the SAT scores they had when they entered Michigan. And what you see is what you would see if you did that almost anywhere. A mildly positive relationship, that kids who came in with somewhat higher SAT scores tended to get somewhat higher cumulative grade averages than students who came in with lower SAT scores. Not much of a surprise. I suppose the only surprising thing is how modest that relationship is, how little variance in grades that you get in college is captured by how well you score on that test. But that's another lecture. I was just sort of struck by it, but the thing that really got me was they also broke out a line separately for African American students. And that really was the statement, was the puzzle. It went against all of my preconceptions of things. And the line showed that at each level of entering SAT score that students came in with, African American students were getting lower grades at Michigan than other students. At each level of SAT score. So even when, you'd think that if you had the same SAT score, roughly the same preparation for college work, you'd be getting roughly the same grade points, the same performance. That's what I thought it was all about at that point in time, that it was about getting preparation right to the same level. Then you wouldn't see these differences, these gaps, these grade gaps, these achievement gaps would vanish. There wouldn't be anything left when you got the preparation the same. But here was a case where there was this difference. It persisted, and it persisted all the way out to the end of the scale. So at the very highest SAT scores, the gap there was the same as it was with the very lowest SAT scores, just absolutely the same. Why would that be? Why would that be? Then within a matter of weeks, we found out exactly the same thing was true for women in advanced math courses at the University of Michigan compared to men, that at every level of entering SAT score, I'm going to step out here because this works. At every level of entering SAT score, women were getting lower grade point averages in advanced difficult math courses at Michigan than were men. Why would that be the case? Well, that's the puzzle. I don't think we completely understand the answer to it even yet, but that was the puzzle. Why would that happen? We quickly looked in the literature, as a scholar is supposed to do, and we found out that not only does it happen at the University of Michigan, but it happens everywhere. It's a phenomenon known as underperformance, that groups whose abilities, intellectual abilities, are negatively stereotyped in the broader society do worse than other students in a situation, some subsequent performance. They do worse than other students, especially when the work is difficult and challenging and kind of at the frontier of their skills. When the work is more within their skill level, you don't see such a dramatic difference. But when that work gets difficult and you have to push through, that's where you start to see this mysterious underperformance. And it happens even when, as I have been saying, the very definition of the phenomenon is it happens when the preparation is the same. So there's no skill difference here that's explaining it. Something else is explaining it. And as a psychologist, this seemed like there must be some psychology involved in this. There has to be some kind of a process here. And it's important because this is affecting people's life course, and it's affecting the distribution of groups of people throughout the society. And it's a big deal. So we took up that problem. Why is this underperformance happening? That is the problem that started this research. And I'm going to just jump over about 5 years of research and going down one bad idea pathway and the next idea pathway till eventually we come up with this notion of stereotype threat. And so stereotype threat is in part an answer to that basic problem, that underperformance is coming, at least in significant part, if not totally, it's coming from the phenomenon of stereotype threat. And what I mean by stereotype threat is a very simple definition. Anytime you're in a situation or you're doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities, your age, your race, your dialect, your region of the country you come from, your religion, anytime you're in a situation where a negative stereotype about one of those identities is relevant to the situation you're in, you know that you could be judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. And if you care about the thing you're doing in that situation, the prospect of being reduced to a stereotype like that can be upsetting and distracting and disturbing. And it can have a prolonged effect. It can signal to you that, geez, I feel uncomfortable in this whole domain of life, and I don't really want to stay here. I want to go somewhere else. So that's how that stereotype threat, we argue, comes to have an effect on an individual and some of the most important choices that an individual has. It's the stereotype, the nature of stereotypes in a given society. They come into relevance to you personally when you're doing something for which one of those stereotypes is relevant. And then it becomes like a way, a framework for interpreting what's happening to you personally. And it gets a much more intensely felt in that circumstance. It's a very general phenomenon. I think that's an important thing to point out at the outset, because in seeing one's own form of stereotype threat, one can see how stereotype threat would affect another group. And everybody has some form of stereotype threat. There's not a single identity that I can think of that doesn't have some kind of negative stereotype about it. The example that Jim just gave about white males coming in to have a conversation with two black guys about a racially loaded topic like racial profiling. Well, what's the stereotype threat there? It's a powerful form of stereotype threat that I could screw up, say something, and I'd be seen as racist. I'd be seen in terms of that stereotype about whites, and that is just horrifying to me. And so I'm going to minimize the chance of that and put them farther away. So everybody has some form of stereotype threat. Sometimes they're kind of ridiculous and silly about some kind of an identity. But sometimes, depending on the stereotype, depending on the domain to which it's relevant, the stereotype threat, I think, becomes a powerful force in the lives of whole groups of people and whole societies, and explains some of the patterns of achievement and so on that we have in life. So that's the argument. In illustrating this, I and my colleagues, I have to give them credit for this because they've heard me give this talk for many years, and they have pointed out in recent years, you need some new updated kind of examples, man. And so we put our heads together. One task we gave ourselves was, well, can you think of a circumstance where a white male, a white guy, would be under the negative stereotype in an intellectual domain of life? Can you think of an example like that? And honestly, it took us about 30 seconds, and we came up with the topic of rapping. Hip-hop, rapping. That is an extremely difficult intellectual challenge. Two rappers come out on stage, and one rapper, they flip a coin. One rapper goes first, and he levels insults about the second rapper, who he doesn't even know, but he levels these in. He has to make them up, and he has to be kind of creative in making them up. You're going to see something in a minute. You have to make them up, and you have to do it in time, and you have to do it in rhyme, and there's a whole audience sitting there. It's a highly pressured, very difficult, challenging intellectual task. But it's an African-American form, art form. And so there is in that area, in that world, a stereotype that white guys just can't do it that well. Man, I don't know what is it with their thing, but they just can't do it that well. So there's a stereotype out there, you're white with a mic. You can't do it, man. You're just like white with a mic. So it's a negative stereotype. The second rapper, he has to respond to these insults, and he has to do it creatively and do it in time and in rhyme. So it's a really demanding task. And so we have, I'll just give you a video, a brief video of this. This is the first few minutes of the movie 8 Mile, which is this biographical movie of Eminem, the great white rapper. I like it because it ends well. The whole movie is about how he overcomes this threat. And we all know this guy is an amazing rapper. I mean, the lyrics are, questionable, and you'll see in this you'll see in this tape that we had to do an awful lot of editing to make it presentable in a setting like this. But you'll also see some of the challenge there, and you'll see how the movie begins with his own experience of an intense stereotype threat around this thing. So why don't we just take a quick look, and we'll go from there.
This ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Hold on. This ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Scared to death and scared to living the life that is diamonds and guns. There's numerous ways you can choose to earn funds. Some get shot, locked down, and turn nuns. Cowardly hearts and straight up shook ones, shook ones.
You can't go backstage.
Man, come on, dog. I got a stamp on my
You
hand,
gotta go around front.
Man, you just seen me,
I
dog.
didn't see
I just
nothing.
came from
Out front, just like
Man, you
everybody.
just seen me. I just went to the
Out front,
bathroom.
just like everybody. I think you better
Straight, dog. He's straight.
be with you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, Future. But I think
Seconds. Spin that. I'ma murder this man. He the type to lose a fight with. They don't laugh cause you whack, they laugh cause you white with a mic. You a laughing stock. You know what is laughing stock? When you will ever last, ass get popped. You a wigger that invented rhyme for.
DJ, kick it.
Difficult day for Eminem that day. But, you know, the good news is he does prevail. That's important. Again, about not being depressing about Stereotype, too, I want to spend a good amount of time showing how people get out of it all the time and how you can reduce it and strategies and the like. But here also, I want you to just pay attention to all the things that led up to his getting on stage. Because when we talk about what makes stereotype threats strong, it's often these features of a situation, the way he's treated, who has to vouch for him, that signal to him how likely he is to be seen in terms of this stereotype. And the more those signals accumulate, the more powerful the impact of the threat is. And what's making the threat difficult and strongly felt for him is the fact that he really cares about doing well in this situation. That's the poignance of it. If one way you can protect yourself against that kind of threat is to stop caring about it. Go into some other domain, give that one up, disidentify with it. And then it's not your personal problem. It may be the problem of other members of your group, but it's not your problem. So one strategy to get out of it is to not care. Eminem cares, and that becomes the challenge. How do you deal with it? How do you stay in that domain and continue to perform at your best? And what are the factors that are making that threat strongly felt? The other question, or the immediate question, or the one that really we're most interested in, given the problem that we start with, is does stereotype threat go to school? Could stereotypes about groups' intellectual abilities have some effect on their performance in school? That's the big question that we're interested in. And I want to use another tape very quickly because I think it illustrates this in, again, a very different context, the kind of process that we're talking about. And I think probably many of you have seen this. This is the footage from the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment that the teacher Jane Eliot did in 1968, the day after Martin Luther King is assassinated. She wants to come up with a classroom demonstration that will let her students in Riceville, Iowa, who a completely homogeneous town, have some sense of what the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's life was about, some sense of that. So she designs an experiment that could never be done today. She decides that she's going to go in the next day. She stays up all night sewing and ironing blue and brown collars that you can put around a student's neck and know what their eye color is. And on one day, she's going to stigmatize the brown-eyed students, and the next day she's going to stigmatize the blue-eyed students. And it's ruthless to see the footage from ABC News filming this experiment. You can follow this on YouTube. It's been, despite human subject review committees that I can't imagine passing this kind of research today, it was done, again, in various places. Once it was done in a prison. Anyway, if you follow all of the people, the original kids, and so on, but there is, well, first what she does to stigmatize them. First day, it's the brown-eyed kids. They have to put on the collars, sit in class with a collar. She says, brown-eyed kids are not as smart as the other kids. They're bad people, and they don't even smell that good. And I think brown-eyed kids should get up and move to the back of the classroom. And she gets them up and moves them back. And the camera's catching the shock on their face. And it follows them across the day. And you see them just kind of huddling, together on the playground. They can't function. They're stunned by this. The teacher they love could do this to them. And the only fairness in the situation is that the next day she does exactly the same thing with the blue-eyed kids. She puts a blue collar on them, and she says blue-eyed kids are bad people and not smart and don't smell good, and stigmatizes them. So one thing that has always caught my eye for some reason or another is one part in the documentary. You see her on the side of the room with a group of kids, and they're going through a problem deck, and she is keeping track of how fast they work through the problem deck. So so it's kind of a rough measure of cognitive performance in this situation. And here's what happens when that, under that task.
I use Orton Gillingham Phonics. We use the card pack. And the children, the brown-eyed children, were in the low class the first day, and it took them 5.5 minutes to get through the card pack. The second day, it took them 2.5 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the fact that now they were superior people.
You went faster than I've ever had anyone go through the card pack. Why couldn't you get them yesterday?
We had those collars on.
You think the collars kept you?
You just keep thinking about those collars.
Oh.
And my eyes kept getting rolling around.
Oh, and you couldn't think as well with the collars on.
Well,
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
I know we weren't going to make it.
How long did it take you yesterday?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. How long did it take you today?
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
What happened?
One down.
Why? What are you thinking of?
This.
Well, I think that gives some image of how an identity and how people think about an identity might preoccupy you to the point that you don't have a lot of cognitive resources left to perform a task that's in front of you. And as the more pressure the task gets, the more likely that's going to be the case. Here's a timed exercise in a classroom. You could look at a standardized test and imagine the same kind of pressure, place where that time comes together as a pressure on performance. Though this is an awfully heavy-handed, you got to admit, way of implementing a stereotype. Now, I just saw some research by a colleague, Naila Nazir, which reminds me that maybe it's not so heavy-handed. She's looking at kids in an Oakland junior high school and how they use stereotypes. And there are 4 roughly equal-numbered groups there: whites, Asians, Latinos, and blacks. And she's kind of measuring there how they use stereotypes. And she finds that in 7th grade, they kind of like to use stereotypes. It's like they discovered a new way of talking about each other. So they actually like it. And so she would get a circumstance where one kid would behave in a way that was counter to the stereotype of his group. And then she could see how the stereotypes would fill in behind. So she has this case of an African-American male who gets the highest math grade in the class. And what the kids all say, excited for him, happy, cheering him on, is that, man, there must be some Asian in you, man. So stereotypes are out there and do still have life in our complex society with a history. That's one thing I feel about this research, is that it puts you in contact with history, the history of the United States. we'll talk about that in a minute, but in a different society, stereotypes are different, even around women in math, and you get different outcomes. I'll come to that. But for us, a lot of the performance circumstances that would go into something like the underperformance that launched this research would not be as heavy-handed as Jane Eliot's blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment would be. So we wondered, could you just get this if you didn't do anything? Could you get a stereotype threat effect if you didn't do anything? So that was the first experiment we ever did. And that was like, as I say, 5 or 6 years down the road of wrestling with this problem. And it was a very simple experiment. We got women and men, sophomores at the University of Michigan, who were really good at math and really cared a lot about math. It was something that was important to them personally and to their career plans. And they were really, as I say, good in it. They had at least 2 calculus courses, scored very well on the SATs. And here they are, presenting. We bring them into the lab one at a time and give them a very difficult math test, the half-hour section of the graduate record exams you take if you're a math major. Not the general quantitative GRE, but the math major, the special exam. Really a hard exam. It's going to be at the frontier of their school skills. It's going to be frustrating, and that's what we want to happen. Our idea is that once it's frustrating, that will make the stereotype in our society about women's math ability relevant to interpreting what's happening to them in that situation. It's the frustration that brings on the stereotype as a possible interpretation of why they're not doing well in that immediate situation. And so that would make it a very different situation for women than it would for men. Men would be frustrated too, of course. They'd say, geez, this is a hard test. I'm not doing as well as I thought I would do. Maybe I'm not as good at math as I thought I was. They would have all that going on. But in addition to that, women would say, geez, is what they say about women true? That experience could stage that and make that stereotype relevant as a personal interpretation. And when we did that experiment, we completely reproduced in the laboratory the underperformance that we'd seen earlier. Women dramatically underperformed compared to men, even though we had carefully selected them for being equally prepared. That was the logic of the whole thing. So we knew they were really just as good, but they didn't perform. They performed a full standard deviation lower than men in that situation. Now, quickly, I can't believe how naive we were. I try to talk about this a little bit in the book, that we didn't think of this alternative interpretation sitting out there for these data. And the alternative interpretation is the biological interpretation. That maybe all you've done, Steele, with all your research, is to just show that women do. There is a biological difference between men and women that manifests in math, that manifests itself in difficult math tests. And that's really all you got there. So you don't have any evidence for stereotype threat. Okay, a year back in the lab stewing about, we knew the experiment we had to do, but how do you do it? What we had to do is do the experiment over again, but take the stereotype threat that women we think are under, take it out of the situation. And we would expect that if you took it out of the situation, their performance would go up and match that of equally skilled men. We knew we had to do that, but we just couldn't figure out how to do it. And finally, we came up with a pretty simple strategy. We did the experiment over again, men and women alone in a room taking a difficult math test. Before each of them sat down to take the test, we simply said, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests. You may have heard that. But that's not true for the test that you're taking today. The test that you're taking today is a test in which women always do as well as men. You know, the subtext is, there's nothing you could do on this test that would tell you anything about your being a woman. You could be frustrated and understand that you're not as good maybe at math as you thought you were, but it wouldn't be because you're a woman, because women do just as well on this math test as do men. So with that simple instruction, that little bitty simple instruction, you have made the stereotype out there in society unrelevant, not relevant to their performance on that test. It's not, you don't have to worry about that. Maybe the first time in their lives they ever took a math test without that worry being there. And sure enough, that, God, I can't tell you how much this meant to us. It worked. When you did that, women performed just as well as the men. Just as well as the men, which gave us the first real piece of evidence that maybe the stereotype threat thing is a big deal. Maybe this thing really could be a pressure on math performance. It happens not all the time, not any time you give somebody a math test, because a lot of times the test is pretty easy for the women, and they're not going to experience any frustration. They're going to do maybe even better than men, and subsequent data shows that. Women do better on moderately difficult math tests than men do. The motivation maybe to beat the stereotype leads them in that circumstance to do better than the men. But when that test is very difficult, that's when the stereotype starts to interfere with the thinking and the processing that's needed to do well on the test, and performance goes down. And it's felt. You measure every single physiological measure we could think of over the years now has been measured. Which part of the brain is active, where's the attention allocated, what's heart rate, what's the stress indicators. All these things are fired up for women, indicating considerable interference, and it's like multitasking. You're trying to do two things at the same time. You're trying to do the tests, but at the same time you're kind of I can do this. What they say about women isn't true. I don't believe that. It couldn't possibly be true. If I just bear down and focus, I'll do. Well, that's a lot of attention being allocated to how you should perform under pressure, as opposed to just being allocated to doing the test. So it takes a toll there. Same thing with race. Josh Aronson and I quickly replicated these experiments, or did very similar kinds of experiments with regard to African Americans and IQ test performance. I won't tell you ours. I'll tell you somebody else who later on did a much better job than we did. They gave just black and white college students, this is Brown and Day, gave black and white college students the golden standard of IQ test, the Raven's Progressive Matrices IQ test, which is a nonverbal IQ test. It's just every item is a big square with a pattern on it, and then there's five little squares with a pattern on each one of those, and you have to pick which of the 5 little squares, which pattern matches the pattern of the big square. That's all you got to do. That's all there is to it. Except that it gets really hard. That's what they call them, the progressive matrices test. And you start to experience frustration. And of course, our idea is that when frustration occurs, it makes the stereotype about your group's ability relevant as an interpretation of what's happening to you. You can't just dismiss it. It's out there and available. A sane person, let's put it that way, it isn't even very consciously, explicitly going on, but you just know how you could be seen and what you could be confirming. And the prospect of that is upsetting and distracting enough to interfere with performance. And sure enough, black kids, college kids, perform a standard deviation lower than white kids in that experiment, which is exactly the size of the white-black IQ gap in the larger society. You get it right there in the laboratory, you can produce it. But to reduce stereotype threat in that situation, this is why I like this experiment. It was so much more clever than ours. Using that nonverbal test, they could represent the test not as a test of ability at all, but just as a puzzle. It's just a puzzle. And it's got nothing to do with ability. It's like a puzzle, man. And when you're doing a puzzle, you're looking for frustration. That's why you're doing the puzzle. You kind of want that. So when you present the thing as a puzzle, there's no difference between black and white performers on that. No difference. So, experiment after experiments, we would replicate these things. I can't tell you how many we piled up in the laboratory before we would even tried to publish this stuff. But because it just is a set of ideas that people, I hope things are changing, but initially, that people found it just hard to believe that an ephemeral thing out there, and all people found it hard to believe. People who would be maybe benefited by these results found it hard because nobody wants to believe that you're functioning under this kind of pressure in a free society. You don't want to believe that tied to your identity is this kind of a problem, and that it's difficult to overcome, and that it could affect your outcomes, it could affect your choices. It's just a lot to. So we definitely had pushback, not the least of which comes from the testing industry itself. They're selling tests that are supposed to be pretty objective, fair measures of intellectual promise, because we use them to allocate opportunity in this society. We have this kind of, if you were a Martian and you came into a society and you saw how we were allocating opportunity, access to great universities like this one, based on a 2 or 3 hour test that you take in one sitting on some day, and that the score you get on that is used to allocate things, they'd wonder, well, that must be a test that really is a real good measure of everything that's going to follow, right? Of course, it's not. I mean, under the best of circumstances, it captures about 18% of what goes into freshman grades, and less after that. And there are big group differences in levels of performance, and big group differences in the degree to which these tests predict how well you're going to do in college. So we use these things, we should just be open about it, because we don't have an alternative. We have to allocate opportunity some way, and this gives us a number. It looks to the public like it's fair enough number, and so we use it. And it gives us some information. It's not like it's devoid of any information. I kind of myself think of that as worth about maybe 4 points. That you should take SAT and divide it into 4. There's a 1, there's a 2, there's a 3, and there's a 4. And after that, it doesn't give you much more information, even though we're interpreting, my small point differences and making a big deal out of these things. Anyway, as I said, that's another lecture. We can come back to that set of issues. But so these experiments were happening. We started to get the knack of them. You could do them with all kinds of groups. What about Asian women taking a difficult math test? There's 2 identities, a gender identity that's negative, for which a negative stereotype is relevant, and there's an ethnic identity for which a positive stereotype is relevant. Well, what will happen? Well, it depends on which stereotype you remind them of before they take the test. If you remind them of gender, they do worse. If you remind them of ethnicity, they do better. There is a phenomenon called stereotype lift, where if you're in the group that's positively stereotyped in the domain, you kind of get an extra benefit. I use myself as an example of being a pretty bad basketball player for an African-American male. It was just given the stereotype there. But the frustration in the domain didn't really bother me. My bad performance didn't bother me so much, because this is our group. This is what we do. I felt like failure and the like didn't signal that I should leave the domain. Maybe other people thought that, but I felt like, okay, it's okay. Okay, you give. We did one of the best demonstrations. We gave a difficult math test to girls and boys in a junior high school. And they all flunked the test. And we asked them after, well, how'd you do, and so on. And the gender difference was just dramatic. The boys said, when you say, look, you didn't do very well, what do you think? And the boys would say, well, I got a terrible teacher this year, and we didn't even cover that material, and that's just, and the test wasn't that bad, wasn't that good either. And they just, and they sort of whistle off. But you give the feedback to the girls, and the girls say, maybe I'm not so good at math. And it is the cultural framework, the stereotypes, that make that a plausible interpretation for a girl, and make it a fairly plausible interpretation for a boy, that there must be some other reason that I didn't do that well in this circumstance. Let's go to Poland, where roughly 50% of the people in quantitatively based fields are women, so that there is not a big evidential basis around for the gender stereotype with regard to math. You don't get very strong stereotype threat effects. They're just, that you get stereotype threat effects in relation to other identities and other things, but not in relation to math, because that's just not such an obvious thing to a kid growing up in Poland, with 50% of the engineers being women, 50% of the physicians, the physicists. So a lot reflects the organization. I'm going to talk about this, the organization of society, how it's organized around these identities. It's where a psychologist is trying to be a sociologist to some degree. Well, one other thing I want to say before getting off of this stereotype thread is that it is a condition of life. It isn't something you can defeat and have it gone from your life. It will come back anytime you're in a situation where the stereotype is relevant. You may get into situations where it just isn't plausible that you're seen that way. That, I think, happens to a lot of us a lot of times. And so it doesn't become a problem. But it is a condition of life. This is the last clip I'll use. This is an interview with Charles Blow, another African-American editorialist for the New York Times. He's got a new book out there. He's all around these days. And here he is talking about the Trayvon Martin situation. And I think it's just a good little piece of dialogue to illustrate the way in which stereotype threat being in the sights of a stereotype about your group is a condition of life. So.
I mean, this is a very interesting point and part of the column I wrote last week, which is about the burden that young black men feel in this country. And it is a very heavy weight on their shoulders all the time, because you cannot behave like all of the rest of your friends. You have to watch. I mean, it's almost exhausting.
You can't wear a hoodie.
Well, not only can you not wear a hoodie, but you literally are consciously paying attention to the way you move your body.
Right.
It is a physically exhausting exercise to know I can't run or make a sudden movement because now I see some cop standing on the corner and he's looking this way. Or I can't put my hands in my waistband, as George Zimmerman says that Trayvon Martin had his hands in his waistband, because that may signal that I have some sort of weapon. This kind of constant having to think about how you are positioning your body so that no one takes advantage of that and views you as suspicious and maybe takes your life or takes you to jail is exhausting.
So, of course, that's a man under the pressure of a stereotype that comes from the way our society, the history of our society, and the way our society continues to be organized around race. It gives that identity its significance. I start the book out by talking about my experience as a kid in Chicago when it was still segregated, and you could buy clothes, but you couldn't try them on in department stores, and you couldn't eat at this place, and you couldn't eat at that. There's all these little petty segregations, and when you're a little kid, you don't know what the hell they're about. You have no sense of what it's about. You don't even know who you are. You just know that this particular identity is like a big deal. So it's forced on you, and that is a good illustration of that. So let's get to the question of remedies. And to begin, to get there, the first thing to do is to describe the understanding that came out of our work as to what causes stereotype threat, what makes it strong and what makes it weak. And we thought initially what makes it strong as psychologists would be some kind of internal psychological vulnerability. Everybody talks about that. That's the favorite theory of the social sciences about the experience of being a member of a stigmatized group throughout the 20th century, is that you internalize the stereotype, and then when you're in a situation where it's relevant, it gets triggered, and then you self-fulfill the behavior. Interestingly, ironically, this explanation was invented by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The Philadelphia Negro, at the end of the 19th century. But I've always hated that explanation. I suppose that's true for many of you. And I don't think people really internalize these things. At some point you do. When you disidentify and you don't care about the domain anymore, you might be open to that kind of a theory about your own group. But as long as you're in there trying, you're not admitting that your group is somehow the stereotype is somehow true. So at any rate, it didn't hold, and the biggest fact that cautioned us, or that told us it didn't work, is that stereotype threat effects I've just described only happen to people who really care about the domain of performance where the stereotype is relevant. If you don't care, you don't experience it. So women who don't care about math, they don't experience it, even when they're taking a math test. It's just not them. They don't care. It's not relevant. So, but when you do care, that's when you feel the stereotype threat. So it's the vanguard of the group. It's the group that are really good at math, really invested in math. That's the members of the group that feel this threat the most. And what makes them feel it the most isn't so much what's inside the head, but it's what's in the situation that is signaling the extent to which you could be seen that way. So if you're the only woman in a situation, you're in that kind of solo status, you're going to feel that pressure in that, because you feel like, geez, I could be seen as a woman here, and everything I do could be interpreted that way, and it's there. If the numbers start to change, you know, when Sandra Day O'Connor was the only woman justice on the Supreme Court, she said the experience was asphyxiating. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg got there, she said, it went away. There was another person. It didn't make sense for the reporters to follow me and hound me and to look at everything from the standpoint of how I'm representing women. Am I smart enough? Am I wise? Those kind of questions went out the door. That's critical mass. The numbers of people in a situation is a profound cue as to whether that identity is going to be, elicit stereotype treatment and perception or not. So we all count. I'm listening to my son's band play in a club, and I'm counting how many other gray-haired people are there in here. And, I'm looking around for that. Why on earth am I doing that? Why would I even think to do that? Well, you're trying to figure out what it means. Is there something that this identity means here in some way or another? So it comes from the cues in the situation. And when you think about remedies, the very first thing to think about is the cues and how they tell us, signal to us that an identity is significant. We did an intervention at the University of Michigan, and I'll never forget this experience. I went in there with the adults, the people that ran the dorms into it. We're going to do it in a big dormitory at Michigan. We went in at the beginning of the year with the people who run the dormitory, the staff, the student residential staff, and we all gave great speeches about how this is a wonderfully diverse society and everything is fantastic and wonderful. It's just fantastic. And the students kind of said, yeah, that's cool. They were kind of with that. But then about 2 weeks later, as the fraternities and sororities started to do their rushes, all the white kids left the cafeteria and left the black kids in the cafeteria. And then about 2 weeks after that, when the black fraternities and sororities did their rushing, the blacks all left the cafeteria and left all the whites there. Now that is a cue that your race is still really important, because it is organizing some of the most basic things about being a human being. And I don't care what the adults say and how committed they are and how little they can imagine that you're under any racial pressure in a situation. Down on the ground, the place is still organized like that. Still organized like that. Our history is still in play. So that's an important thing, I think, to realize about that. That as our institutions change, we have to look at how they're organized and what message that's signaling. When Eminem is coming out of the bathroom there, just everything that's happening to him is telling him he's going to be seen as white with a mic. I'm telling you, just everything you feared is going to be true. So no matter what anybody tells him, that's the message he gets from the cues in this situation. So that's the sociologist in us, is discovering how much this context affects the internal, the nature, the experience of the situation. It's a lot has to do with cues. When you go into Berkeley High School, you see instantly, I don't care what the adult says, there's 2 high schools there. There's one upstairs that's a pretty good, almost like a white upper middle class prep school, and there's one in the basement for black and Latino kids. They're tracking systems. They're not in the same courses. They're just parallel universes in the same building. So and you can, in my region of the country, I'll just speak for that, you can see that everywhere. You just walk into a school and you can see the cues that drive the significance of that identity, and that identity starts to have an impact on performance and starts to be a huge signal about where people belong and where they don't belong, and you can't convince a kid to feel differently than what the reality is that they're experiencing. So I think that's where the first level of attention of remedy has to be applied, is down at that level. We have to break some of these structures that reflect our history, that are tied to our history as a society and the way our society is organized. We got to pay some real attention down on that level. Okay. In the meantime, we got to do some other things. We should have role models and existence proofs. Is one thing to be in a country where an African American can be the president. It's very different than being in a country where an African American cannot be the president. Same thing is true for women. Same thing is true for almost any group. Is it enough to completely upturn this racial order and this history I'm talking about? Of course not. But it's meaningful. So we have to do things that are meaningful like that in a situation. There are other things. I'm going to just end with two things, and then I'll probably stick in some other ideas when we have conversations. But one that I think is less obvious to people. This came from that very same intervention study I was describing at the University of Michigan. We had Thursday night bull sessions with 15 students. There were 250 in the whole program, but every Thursday in little groups of 15, roughly of the same demographics as the larger campus. So there'd be about mostly white kids, about 4 or 5 black kids, and so on. And we had them meet every Thursday, and they talked just about personal things. They didn't talk about race, they didn't talk about politics, they didn't talk about affirmative action, just about money, parents, girlfriends, boyfriends, all that basic stuff. They talked like that for 6 months, every Thursday. And it just had an explosive effect on the grades of African American students. Their grades went up immediately, a third of a letter grade, and 4 years later, after this, we did this for just the first semester of college. 4 years later, they were graduating at almost twice the rate, a good third addition ahead of other African American students at Michigan, just as a function of that experience. Why would that be? Well, what they're getting is evidence that a lot of what happens to them happens to everybody. And when you're talking to personally, who do you talk to? You talk primarily to members of your own group personally, about personal things. And when you have that, then a lot of what happens to you because of your membership in that group, and it makes so much sense given the history and nature of society. And so you tend to expand the degree to which that group identity is important in interpreting everything that happens to you. But when you actually talk to people from a different group, from a different background, and you find out that things happen all over the place. It happened to him too. The TA didn't return the email. And the professor said the same nasty thing to him that he said to me. And so pretty soon, that identity becomes less relevant as an interpretive frame for your experience in the situation. And you can relax. You just feel safer. And then you can pay attention to what's being offered, what's in front of you, and you can make some progress, and you make some progress, and you feel even more like that. And it kind of pretty soon lessens the whole threat in the situation. Talking across group boundaries, big deal in this kind of thing. I also can tell a story about my own experience in graduate school, and how I think over time I just, through the help of a advisor who was just directly interested in me, gave me a sense of relief from this. But I am wary of time. Do I have 2 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. I'll just tell the story, I'll get it on the table. I tell it also in the book, so in some detail, maybe too much detail. I don't know. But so I go to graduate school, and this is a long time ago, 1967, and I'm the only African American in the psychology department and in all the social sciences, and sure enough, and there are faculty who would use the N-word in class in those days, and who really thought that black people were genetically inferior. I mean, there was a big flank of psychology in my field that felt that way, and there may still be some. And then the school, the values of the school, it's all about who's smart and who's really, really, really smart, who's got the real goods, who can really do this. And the people who are revered, none of them look like me. None of them. So, I mean, I was in complete personality lockdown. It was painful to be in that situation, just painful. I could not raise my hand and talk to anybody about anything because the fear was that I would use dialect or something would happen and they would judge me in terms of the stereotype. And I was heavily involved. I loved psychology. I loved it. So it went on. Then as time goes on, my advisor, who I was coming up for tenure, and I was his only graduate student, so that may have been a factor in this, but he began to just treat me like I was somebody to listen to occasionally. He'd stick his head in my office and he'd say, "So Claude, so what do you think about this, man? What do you think about that?" And I just remember that was like, "You care what I think about this?" And I would make sure I had something that I thought about that, and I really worked, I worked because I felt in that relationship, given the larger context, in that relationship, here was a guy that was just sort of willing to take me as I was. I didn't have to be something else. And I could relax there, and we could talk, and we talked, man, and I really produced for this guy. We got a publication, and then when we got a publication, it was like, man, maybe I can really do this thing. Maybe there's room for me here. Maybe the field isn't this threat, isn't so much that I can't cope with it. And so all of a sudden, with that kind of an experience, the cues in the situation they didn't change a bit, that those people using the N-word were still there. There still were no role models in the field. None of those things were there, but they just didn't matter as much. And I bet a lot of people in this audience have had that kind of an experience, where you have that apprehension and you in it, and you realize after a while, A, they're not thinking about me that much. They don't care that much. B, I think I can do this. I think there is enough room for my work to be taken seriously here. And you kind of start to relax in a situation. And as time goes on, you're not being seen primarily that way, and you get to be quite comfortable in a situation. So I want to end with that kind of a narrative, because I think that's one way by which a lot of us deal with the forms of stereotype threat that we're talking about, the forms that groups whose intellectual abilities are negatively stereotyped. That's one way that we deal with them. That's in interracial relationships. That's another way we deal with them. I think friendships are a good example. It really happens there, where people start to feel pretty secure with each other pretty quickly, that they're not going to be judged stereotypically in a friendship. So friendships give us a good model for how this kind of how you can deflect this kind of a process. But your understanding of the world starts to broaden in ways that make the world less threatening in this regard. So I want to end at least on that kind of a reasonably hopeful note, and now we can get to some of the difficult questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for explicating whistling Vivaldi. One of my colleagues said maybe we should have you whistle a little bit, but I didn't want to put you under that stereotype threat.
You wouldn't appreciate what would happen, I don't think.
Or maybe Vivaldi wouldn't appreciate it.
He certainly wouldn't. I've only met one person who could actually whistle Vivaldi, and it did turn out to be an African American.
All right.
Yeah, so I will put that in there. He was a producer of television and show in San Francisco, and he could actually whistle 4 seasons.
Fabulous. Fabulous. All right, so you've talked a lot about the stereotype threats and that they're pervasive, and we have stereotypes that are stereotypical messages that are pervasive. How young are these messages communicated? Where do they come from? And how can we start addressing those positive narratives, those alternate narratives that you've discussed in the book and this evening to children, and so that we're not looking at college freshmen in that way?
Well, they do happen, I think, very, very young. I think I would interpret the famous doll studies of Kenneth and Mamie Clark as I could at least offer the hypothesis that they reflect stereotype threat to some degree, that even at 4 years of age, you become aware in the United States that there is something about this identity that you've got, because people do respond differently to you under circumstances. It may be that you don't get invited to birthday parties or something. Something happens that you know being black is significant. And so I think it does happen very young. I have a lighter interpretation than they did in those days. They have a very deep psychoanalytic, as I said, Du Bois kind of interpretation that at 4 years of age they're internalizing a self-hatred, and then self-hatred is the demoralizing force that is with we blacks for the rest of our. I don't buy that, because blacks have the highest self-esteem of any subgroup in the United States. When you measure it, when you just measure it, that's what you get. It's like a great puzzle to us, because people wonder how can this theory be true and yet that fact be true. But I think there's a lot of work we have to do, and we have developed over centuries a lot of supportive mechanisms that can sustain a sense of ourselves. So there are a lot of reasons that I could point to for why that self-esteem fact is true, but that's nonetheless, in my generation of social psychologists, we're under the weight of that theory for a long time, and a lot of us have responded in ways that it just didn't seem right. Now there's another generation that's going to say, all this doesn't seem right, and that's good, but we brought the ball down this far. Okay. So what you do, I think, is you disarm those cues as much as possible. You really do look at the circumstances. You try to have do things a lot of schools and teachers instinctively know how to do. I don't want to say people have to do something completely unthought of. Have black heroes, have Obama in there. I think we are beginning as a society to do some of the work that makes it clear that, even though some little things here could suggest that this identity is not so cool, but there's a lot of other things that show that it is a great identity. It is something of great value in this situation. So I think the first tact, especially at that age, because you can't explain things to them, and they couldn't articulate the stereotype, and they don't know any of that, have any of that cognitive apparatus evolved yet. It's really at the level of signals in a situation that if in the classroom I would attack that. I would make the reading and the protagonists in the literature that they read, that everybody reads, vary across groups. That will help. And not just have the literature be about one group's protagonists. I'm sure people in this audience would be better at enumerating these things than I would, but that's how I'd go about it.
And in the book you talk, thank you to your wife pushing you into looking at teachers.
I should be pushing my wife's book. I'll do that in a minute. I'm glad you brought that up, because if she got wind of the fact that I went this far without bringing up that book, I'd be.
Well, she had you and your colleagues looking at teacher techniques,
yes,
and what the positive counter narratives that can be built within it. But a lot of that was around differentiated instruction, getting children engaged in the learning, and then there's the counter narrative of high stakes testing and a lot of that academic accountability that may, have teachers kind of, all right, is this going to be on the test? Is this I'm going to do this to kind of break down stereotype threats, heroes, different authors, expand the canon, as it were. But then, is this what is going to then prove to the outside world that these children are capable because they've passed this high-stake test? Is that my classroom going to be seen in a positive way? Is my school, is my job, is my, there's so many snowballs of accountability right now that I'm really wondering where we're at the psychological level of mitigating stereotype threat, yet on the macro level of accountability.
Yeah,
so could you solve that for us,
Yeah,
please?
boy, I am trying to write about this because I do think there's this massive thing, massive thing. And I'll take a second to describe that thing, and then I'll answer that. I'll try to show you how it answers. I think it answers that question. I think there's so much that's wrong. There's a perspective problem here that when I look at kids as an observer, I see the kid. And you tell me that the kid has problems, that he doesn't achieve as well as you'd like, and so then I start to think just naturally, well, what's it about him that leads to these problems? So my perspective as an observer leads me to prefer certain kinds of explanations of that child's performance problems. I look for things inside of him. Maybe he internalizes stereotype. Maybe he's just not that smart. Maybe things about him. And he can't read, and I know he can't go on in this school, in this world, unless he can read. So I am going to put in place a situation that gets that kid to read, and I'm going to hold the people that are responsible for that accountable to doing that. And I've got to measure, a whole sequelae of things follow from that perspective. But if you take another perspective, which is to forget being an observer, go around and get into the head of the kid. Mm-hmm. Put yourself in the actor's perspective. This is the actor in the situation, the child. What is that kid experiencing? And when you look at the world from the vantage point of the child, you don't see the child. You just see the circumstances that the child is dealing with. And that gives you a completely different understanding of what's going on. And when you look at the world from that standpoint, you see that a lot of the things that we do as observers that are well-intended are sending a mountain of things that signal that we don't respect that kid or think that much of that kid. You can't read. You need this. Mm-hmm. You need just one thing after the next. You're laying on that kid, and that's what he or she sees, and we wonder why the hell don't they? This education is the greatest opportunity they've got. Why? How could they be throwing it away? Don't they understand? Do their families not support this? But what we're doing is creating a situation that it's like being Eminem. It's coming out of the bathroom onto the stage. All the signals the poor guy's getting are telling him he can't do it. And he gets up there and he can't do it. And we say, well, look at that, he can't do it. We need to ratchet it up more. And so you get this very negative cycle that I think is coming from a limitation of human empathy, of perspective, that we lack. We can do it with our own kids. Mm-hmm. With our own kids, we can see the world from their standpoint. And when we send them to school, we know what we want. And if I've got the resources now in America, I won't send them to a school like that.
Right.
What Diane Ravitch, what'd she say? The rich kids get taught, the poor kids get tested. Mm-hmm. We set up alternatives because we know from the standpoint of our own kids and ourselves. I've got 2 5-year-old grandsons, and what gets them to read is that your reading will get them to something they really want to know about, mm-hmm. and it's also cool in the classroom to do it. And somebody's not testing them all the time or breaking it down into little insufferable parts. They're letting them read. So anyway, I could go on in that vein, but
really?
I think I probably said enough.
All right, well, I do want to get to some more audience questions, so I'll end with this question. We, as a community, have read Whistling Vivaldi. What is the underlying message? What are the underlying actions that you would like us to take away from your work as a community?
Well, I guess maybe it's because it's primed for me, but I begin an answer by saying just what I thought. I do talk about this perspective issue in that book a bit, but I think that's the best general strategy, is to try to see the experience of different students and colleagues from the standpoint of what it's like to be them in the environment. And that will usher in a lot of insight about where the problem lies, what needs to be addressed in a particular situation. As I described about that dorm at the University of Michigan, it was taking the perspective of the students that made it crystal clear that no matter what the adults said, there was still a big fat piece of organization down on the ground that signaled that race was profoundly important, going to be profoundly important to them in that world. And that if we in Michigan really wanted to do something, we had to face that and begin to crack it and begin to reorganize it or represent it or do something that would make it not send the same signal. And so I don't think there's really anything short of that kind of thinking to really make long-term gains. It's to look at how we teach, look at the materials we teach, look at the attitudes that we use in teaching and how that's going to be received by the diversity of students. I think that this is one of the most profound challenges that this increasingly diverse American society has to deal with. I know that's a big fat piece of rhetoric, but I don't think we're sophisticated about thinking about these things in the ways that we're going to be required to do to make real progress. We keep, throughout my long career, we keep banging against some of the same frustrations, and I think it's because it's hard for us to get down on the ground, and the best strategy for doing that I can think of is taking the actor's perspective.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to open up to the audience, and Matt, you've got some tweets for us. Please use the microphones if you have a question that you would like to ask Professor Steele.
Dr. Steele, thank you so much for coming. I want to ask you a question about how do you help diagnose the new micro and macro N-words and N-word ideas that exist in society today? And the second part of my question is more a remedy question. What do you think is the role of ethnic studies, women's studies, and having a diverse faculty as a potential remedy to some of these issues?
Thank you, Cesar.
Yeah, I certainly think those things are important, really important. I was just this afternoon seeing Skip's, Henry Louis Gates's operation over there. I don't know what else to describe it. It's a museum. It's amazing, and you walk in there and you see a part of America and really a part of the world that isn't normally projected into the academic environments that we see. And Skip has done a great job on television with these various shows, bringing to light the true complexity of American history, and through these personal stories and everybody's family. You scratch a little bit, and it's complicated. And there's all kinds of inputs and cross relationships, and my goodness, I think that's tremendous kind of knowledge to have in a university like this. And I think obviously you need the diversity of faculty, a serious ethnic studies a kind of effort to unearth all that knowledge and to present it to the world. So I think it's profoundly important, and it's a profound achievement, and I think Harvard is like way out there in this regard in terms of all that's been accomplished here. I think you don't want to. I think one important thing to recognize about it is, again, how it's organized down on the ground. You don't want it to be just for the ethnic students, if I can use that quote, because that will send the wrong signal. That'll send the signal that it's only important to them, it's not important to anybody else. It's important for any American to have, if you're going to consider yourself an educated American, you can't just know Europe. You got to know America. And that's very critical. The fact that it is intended and seen by an institution as a value for everybody, as a part of everybody's education, that fact sends a signal that who I am is of value in this society and in this university and so on, that does mountains of work in this in this direction. So I think that these things that you're talking about are very important, and I think it's very important to make sure that they're organized and presented to the university the right way.
And just the first part, one of my professors is in the audience, and she knows that I go up this ladder of inference. And my first part of my question is, how do we unpack new N-words? Because there's this new racism without racist. Mm-hmm. And so how do we unpack words like minority or deficit or certain kind of pseudoscience? So how do we unpack the new ideas that are the new nigger word?
Well, I do, I have a mixed reaction. I'll just be honest about it. I do think that those words have been around since I was a graduate student at Ohio State, those many years ago. The debate was just as vigorous, maybe even more vigorous than it is now. And so I think there's been and should continue to be attention paid to graphing out the landscape of challenges that have to be surmounted, and in the social sciences, in education, in these worlds, that we have to understand microaggressions, we have to understand stereotype threat, these phenomenon, and the like. And here I have spent so much of my time trying to graph one out that I don't want to say it's not worth it. It is worth it. We have to know what these is, because it'll tell us how to use that information. But I really think we're at a point now where we have to go farther than that. We really have to focus on the solutions. It can be counterproductive to ring that bell over and over again, because the younger people come into these environments, and it just instantiates that whole perspective towards. So you can start to see it everywhere, and you can get people oversensitized to the phenomenon, and we want to create an environment where their own interests, such as they are, and wherever interests mysteriously come from, they have a chance to guide their lives. We want to clear the path for them to some degree. So I think with that being the goal, it is important to do the kind of work that I've spent the last 25 years doing, graphing out one of these challenges and trying to figure out solutions to it. But I also have the general across the table advice I'd give to my grandson. Get interested in a lot of things. Talk to a lot of different people. Talk to different people, man. That's just going to help you more than you can ever know, because you don't know what you don't know. Right. You don't know what you don't know. And this is a huge reality for us humans. So I think that attitude toward it is something I'd love to see become the dominant approach to it.
Okay, thank you. Please, introduce yourself.
Hi, Dr. Steele. My name is Ola. I'm a master's student here. I just wanted to say I'm really fond of your work, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you.
I've always found the story of the man whistling Vivaldi in Central Park really fascinating, especially the idea that he could maybe lessen the stereotype threat directed against him by whistling that. But I remember after the death of Trayvon Martin reading an article about how whistling Vivaldi won't save you, based on this idea that there's a boy living in a gated community but still could be subject to that sort of violence. And I appreciated the part in the book where you emphasized changing identity contingencies, not just the behaviors and outcomes, but really focusing on what people are reacting to. And so my question for you, in light of Trayvon Martin, a boy living in a gated community, or the death of Mike Brown, a college student, what does it really take to change an identity contingency?
Thank you.
Ooh. It's hard to do it yourself, because the examples I can think of are things that are tied to like I use it's better to talk about this in terms of examples of when I was a kid. There was all these little segregations. Well, those were contingencies of my identity, things I had to deal with because I had this identity, and that forced on me thinking about, well, what the hell does this identity mean? Why do people think this way about this identity? And who were they and who were we? And it just raises all these kinds of questions. So you can see from that unraveling those contingencies is doing away with segregation in that example. And I think in modern life, a lot of the same thing is true. Do we really need to track kids so much on the basis of these tests, which completely confound identity? So you walk in almost any school that has a significant African American Latino population, and you see the African American Latinos and kids in one kind of class, and you see other kids. Oh, that's a contingency. That I'm not sure we really need that organization. Is that the best way to do it? Can't we take this problem seriously enough to think of other solutions? So it's hard to do it by yourself. I think some of that is, you can see, political, economic pressures that are critical in changing contingencies. So that's the first thing I think about. Now, with regard to Trayvon Martin and whistling Vivaldi, it is he didn't whistle Vivaldi. And if, again, I think about my grandsons across the table, and I'm going to tell them, for their own safety in the United States, and at this day and age, I think as many African American parents would, be careful. Be careful. Don't wear that damn hoodie out there, man, like that. How you think they're going to see you? You're just going to talk like a real parent. You want your kid to live, and you're going to recommend some Vivaldi whistling, so that they don't keep having these events, these things that happen, and yes, they're horrible, and we want to identify and condemn the processes that lead to them. But again, taking a different perspective of the kid, you want them to do that, which is not going to make this any more problematic than it has to be. I don't know another way to say that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Matt, we have a tweet?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Steele. I am the internet surrogate right now, so I'm representing a few folks. One from Southwest United Kingdom, Ben Houlihan, writes, Professor Steele said that stereotypes are different across the world, but can the same strategies be used to address any stereotype? I guess that'll play into Fernando Reamer's global perspective on stereotype threat.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd like to say yes. I do think in principle, at the level of basic process, even in a different part of the world with a very different form of stereotype threat, that some of the same strategies would work. Again, I'd have to hear the particulars that person may be thinking about to be sure of that. But I'd like to be able to answer the question, yes, in principle, I think that the same strategies would be effective.
I'm sure Ben would thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Please, identify yourself.
Hi, yes, I'm from Cambridge and Latin, and at our school we still have tracking. So I feel like it kind of implements the whole stereotypes within we don't have it within the whole entire school, if you're this race or whatever. It's more in our classes, it's honors, CP, and AP. And I feel like as being a black female, I feel like I get into a lot of honors and AP classes, and I feel like when I'm there, I'm the only black female, and I feel kind of it's not like I'm trying to shoot down the stereotypes, and more use them against to my power, and say oh yes, I'm black, but I can still do this, and I'm here, and I just want to you said that the tracking shouldn't be used, so at our school we still have that, so how could I
Yeah. Oh man, I do greatly first empathize with the experience of that, of being in those classrooms as one of a small number, or maybe the only person, and having that be sort of a continued experience of life. It is like the graduate school experience I was talking about. And the idea of tracking that we sort of callously do, if you had a society in which the people who you were trying to educate were relatively homogeneous, ethnically and in other ways, maybe it's not so big a deal. Maybe it would make more sense to do that. But when you have a system that confounds the measures of ability with ethnic identity and with background, that so confounds the two, then something that has a rational basis at one level starts to be extremely destructive on another level. And I think we got to be honest about that with tracking. It emerged, as many of you I'm sure know better than I do, as a quote remedy for integration. This is how we can integrate a school building and not have my kids have to take the same kind of things that other kids have. So it doesn't have a handsome, really, ability, but it's camouflaged as an ability thing by virtue of the test by which it can be used. So now I would, I don't know how to do it. I wish I could give a completely simple, succinct solution to this. Yeah. I can describe it at this point better than I can solve it. There are differences in preparation level, which have to be taken account of in teaching and the like. And if you're a teacher in a school like that, you may feel, I don't care what you say, these kids are going to move a lot faster than these kids, and so on. My general suspicion is, though, that the tracking system itself is sending so many negative signals to kids who aren't favored by that system, that's what's producing them in some big part, the lack of progress and performance in that group. So I think it becomes a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy as time goes on. I think it's true for minority kids. I think it's also true for majority kids. You get labeled like that in the American school system, and you have to contend with that image. It's got nothing to do with race, but it's the same kind of stereotype. It's the same kind of thing. So I think we got to, as educators, do a much better job of dealing with the challenges that we face than to simply use these tests to track people.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's going to have to be our last question. I just want to remind everyone that many of our master's programs are meeting directly after for follow-up discussions, and that we invite our faculty to join those discussions. And I want to thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good? Okay. All right. We're done.
Identity
Okay.
safety.
Identity safety.
Identity safety. Buy that book. It's a great book.